Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Sarah. It's another Tuesday. It's another author interview. It's another day that I am happy to be with you. I am very happy to be with you to talk about books. I am less happy about the heat. It's not even that hot here. Let me preface this. I know that there's heat waves going on in a lot of places, and they are incredibly hot. And I have lived in places that are incredibly hot. I've lived in Texas. I've lived in California. Both places can get much, much hotter than it is here right now. But I don't know. It's not even that humid, but our apartment just does not cool down right now. And so I've been very grumpy about the heat the last few days. And I know I shouldn't be, because it could be so very much worse. But yeah. A little grumpy, but it's okay. This too shall pass. We are going to London this weekend. Very excited about that. I've never been. I've always wanted to go. You know, I'm a little bit of an Anglophile, so I'm really looking forward to that. But also, it's supposed to be a little bit cooler. I shouldn't say that out loud, because as soon as I say that out loud, it's going to just jump up the temperature while we're there. But anyway, enough talk about the weather. Let's talk about a book instead. In particular, let's talk about the book Reggaeton Cruise by Patricio X Maya. He is my guest today. This is his debut novel. It is not the first thing that he has written for publication, but it is his debut novel. And let me go ahead and give you the description of this novel. After getting nearly crushed on his way to Magic America, the migrant drifter most likely to fail posts a song that blows up on YouTube. Cringe factor is part of the viral charm. The flashy farmer must be a joke. But maybe he's the opposite of a joke. He'll sort that out for himself when he performs his smash hit at the flamboyant Reggaeton Cruise, which, thanks to the subversive forces in the mainland, might be a gig to die for, literally. Thrown into the fray are three affluent Japanese sisters who'd signed up for Disneyland, not the Battle of Fallujah, an Estonian gamer groomed by the U.S. Army to draw foreign blood, an Ecuadorian jock with a chip on his shoulder reaching all the way back to torrid Guayaquil, a Liberian refugee gone real estate investor with a gospel to tell, and a potty-mouthed Salvadoran pupusero who serves as an unlikely moral arbiter from afar. Patricio X Maya's characters may be from all over, but they're all caught up in a single net of immeasurable proportions. This net is our common destiny, of course, our plot, capitalism, globalization, and hyperreality. Whether we cry or laugh or decide to get mad, Reggaeton Cruise audaciously decodes the hologram of itself that much of the world has become. Well, if that doesn't intrigue you, I'm not sure what will. I mean, there are so many different elements in this book. It actually starts out when you're reading it. If you didn't have a clue what it was about, if you didn't read that blurb, if you didn't read the back of the book or know what you're getting into, the first chapter reads almost like YA post-apocalyptic fiction. That's just the feeling that I had when I was reading the first chapter. That's about the gamer, and it's set in current, modern day Estonia, but for some reason it felt like this kid was living in a world that seemed very kind of post-apocalyptic, which says a lot about what's going on in this book. And then the next chapter talks about the character that is in Ecuador who travels to America, who has the viral hit, Delphine, and his reads like you've gone back in time, because he has a very agrarian upbringing. It's not the same with the level of social media that we're all used to, or the level of technology that we're all used to. And so it feels like you've gone from this sort of futuristic, apocalyptic world back in time. And you might be thinking, what am I reading? But it's all set in contemporary. It's all set in the same time period. And it's just fascinating the way Patricio weaves all of the stories together and weaves all of the characters together so that they eventually come together in this one spot and create this plot. And I don't want to give too much away, and I want to let him talk about it as well, but just fascinating the different levels that are present in this book, not only with the storylines, but with the characters, with the number of nationalities that are in there, all of the different languages that are spoken throughout the book. Yeah, I could go on about the fascinating layers, but I'm going to let Patricio talk about his work. And so let's turn to that interview. Again, the book is called Reggaeton Cruise. The author is Patricio X. Maya. Hi, Patricio. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I'm excited to talk to you about writing and about your books. Before we get to the book, let's talk about you a little bit. Can you share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a little bit better?
Sure. My name is Patricio X. Maya. I was born in Quito, Ecuador, and where I spent about a decade and 2 years, and then I moved to California, where I went to high school, and then I graduated high school. I majored in English, went to UC Berkeley for a little bit, then dropped out of Berkeley. I wasn't ready. And then I went to Cal State LA, CSU LA, where I majored in English, creative writing. And then I decided to pursue a master's at Syracuse University in arts journalism, which is essentially arts criticism. So I did that. I graduated in about, I think, 2009, just around the time of the Great Recession, which wasn't a good time to graduate. And also newspapers were folding left and right. So I didn't really do too much journalism. I did some criticism, some theater stuff, some musical theater. Actually, I ended up reviewing a lot of that. Some pieces about photography and so on. But my career has mostly been in teaching now. I'm a teacher. I'm a community college instructor, and yeah, I teach writing, but I also teach Spanish, and I have a very full plate nowadays. I'm doing sociology as well, so it's quite a wide variety of subjects that I'm teaching, and I write. You know, I've always been creative, either poetry, essays, and the novel also. So that's pretty much a little bit about my autobiography. I love tennis.
In terms of teaching, we're starting to come out of the pandemic and going back to, I don't know that we'll ever go back to normal life, but are you teaching in person? Are you still teaching mostly online?
It's hybrid at this point. So I go to school once a week, where I meet with students, but mostly online. Next semester will be, I've been told, the first semester where I'm going to teach, face to face, live, and that's going to be a big change because now I've gotten used to teaching from home and not wearing necessarily like the attire that I would wear to go to school. So that's going to be interesting. It's just going to be a change, but I'm glad to finally go back to the classroom next semester. I do miss that, so it just makes for a completely different energy when you teach that way.
Yeah, I can imagine. You might want to put a Post-it note on your front door that says, "Are you wearing pants?" Make sure, you don't.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But I'm very much looking forward to, high-fiving students if they say something right, or,
Yes.
making sure that they're there, looking at you as opposed to with the little cameras where,
Exactly.
You're never sure if that's like like a picture that they put there or something.
Right. Well, even when it's in person, it's hard, I find, on like Zoom, because I'm looking at the person's picture, not the picture, but their video. So I'm looking at them, but I'm not looking at the camera. So I'm not making eye contact. It's
Right.
hard.
Yeah, and I've read some newspaper articles that cite some studies that say that it is measurably more tiring, working online. So
I've
you
heard
feel like
that.
really
Yeah.
tired, so who knows? But it's just a different experience. And I think, at this point, I'm gonna end up doing both for the rest of my teaching, as long as I teach. I don't think it's gonna go away.
I don't
And it
think,
does
yeah.
have a lot of benefits, as well. So
Agreed. Yeah. I agree. Well, let's transition into
yeah.
talking about the book now. It's called Reggaeton Cruise. Can you give an overview of the story?
So, it's interesting that we're talking about the world of online teaching, because the book is a complex sort of narrative with many voices. But I think the theme would be related to the idea of the modern world, the contemporary world, and how the sort of edges between that which is real and that which is sort of fictional, or at least disembedded from reality, in the sense that we're in this like kind of computer cloud that takes more and more of our existence. Then it becomes a sort of reality that's not reality. It's hyper reality. It's the internet reality and whatnot. So the book is about that. It's about a video gamer. That's one of the characters who happens to become an instrumental U.S. Army element who works with drones, and who goes who through gaming enters the world of the most sort of powerful struggles in terms of national safety. So that's one of the characters, and another of the characters is an immigrant from the Andes who comes up through Mexico, through Central America, and makes it to the United States, and is able to sort of improve his life and also enter the world of that sort of cloud, that hyper real parallel world that we all sort of live in with social media. He becomes a famous viral star because he puts up a music video on YouTube, and somehow for some reason people like it, even though the video is not what one expects to be like excellence. They like it in a sort of ironic way. Anyway, essentially these two teenagers have parallel plots in which they are on a course to sort of clash, and that's and the novel is built around that, with all the people they meet, and they finally have their encounter when they in the Reggaeton Cruise, which is central to the novel. So that's what I would say in terms of theme and characters and plot a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we return, we'll be talking more about the contrasts that Patricio was just mentioning and how those play out in the characters and in the books. And I alluded to this a little bit at the beginning, but we'll talk more about it when we return. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Patricio X. Maya about his debut novel, Reggaeton Cruise. Let's go ahead and return to that interview. That contrast between, but you were talking about life in the cloud and being online and social media. The contrast in the first, especially the first 3 chapters, is really interesting because you get the teenager who is the gamer, very much connected to the online world. You have the 3 sisters who are very much connected to social media, and then you have the immigrant who eventually does go viral. But when we first meet him, he's living a very simple life, very agrarian, no social media, no computer, nothing. So that contrast at the beginning I thought was really interesting.
Thanks. I think I wanted to show, that idea of the network. So we all live in a sort of network that is connected, the web, and not necessarily like the online web, like the internet, though also the internet. But that web of, let's say, airports, that connects us all. Once we start traveling, web of freeways, web countries, passports, all this kind of international globalized reality that we live in. Delphine Kishpe, the rural Ecuadorian immigrant who leaves his mountain town after his father's death, has a very different reality. He's not connected to the globalized networks yet. But life is such that it just takes a few steps. In his case, a lot of steps for him to reach that reality, that hyper reality that we seem to live in today. Once he steps in, he's just another member, But I think I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to show that how people from such different backgrounds, whether it be the Furukawa sisters who are wealthy and are traveling and having a lot of fun, and are always on social media, photogram, as I call it in the novel, and Delphine, who wants to migrate and eventually migrates through, a lot of toil, and then, the Arjun Parn, who's the gamer who's in Estonia, and he has a very different situation. He's a sort of star gamer. They eventually meet, as we all do meet, in some way or another, in this world that is so connected, with some of the people that have helped me and my editor with the book are not in the United States. So, they have been, for example, we have a person who's helping us with who designed the book. She was in France, but she was Italian. And God knows what her story was, So that's just the reality of today's reality. I wanted to portray some of that in the book.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Was that your initial inspiration, or what was your jumping off point for this book?
Yeah, so it was a sense, a feeling, that also how wide the reach that we all have today, on a personal level, being that I'm was born in Ecuador, and I pay a lot of attention to the news down there, and also the news here and the news elsewhere. So I had this feeling of being connected to a very wide net. At the time, a few years ago, I was an ESL, English as a second language teacher, and a lot of my students would tell me stories from like Mongolia, and then I lived in Koreatown in LA, and it was an extremely cosmopolitan reality, and that I wanted to. So it does reflect a lot of my personal experience, but somehow it clicked at some point when I watched the viral video of this rural Native American Ecuadorian who had gone actually viral because he posted in the Hispanic world. It was one of the first viral videos because he posted a kind of song that was very sort of haphazardly made, but people took to it, and he literally toured, and there was a documentary made about him, and I'm like, oh my God, what if I incorporated a sort of fictionalized reality version of this guy's voyage. And then I knew some stories from being in LA and whatnot, and somehow it all came together in my subconscious. I made it work, but it was mostly a feeling that I wanted to show the networks, in their progression towards something. They seem to be moving. It's hard to say exactly how it happened, but I just I threw all these elements in there and see how they worked.
Mm-hmm. And so with what you're saying with the network and showing the connections that are so present throughout this book,
Mhm.
it makes a lot of sense for you to write it from the many different points of view that you do. Was that ever hard to keep track of, or did you think about writing it from fewer perspectives? How did that work in terms of your writing process?
I think it was probably, believe it or not, easier. I might have like a kind of. I think if I stuck to a single perspective, I might have been more self-conscious because it would have been my voice. As a kind of first-time novelist, um, I like the fact that I could sort of hide behind my characters and let them talk. Um, so in that sense, I think I had the need from. I think having met so many people, throughout my life, even though I'm not old yet, I have had a rather very extensive just set of experiences. Um, and I think I wanted to portray some of that. And being that English is not my first language, I've always heard, and somebody told me this uh, when I was at Syracuse. A professor of mine said that, non-native speaker writers tend to love to experiment with the sort of mechanics of language or like the plasticity of the language. Um, he mentioned Nabokov and whatnot, and other writers that are not native speakers. And I think I do feel a sense of that, a sense of kind of, okay, well, it's not my native language, so I just want to see the limits of it, and with different characters, different voices, different accents. It was a way to just bring all of that stuff together. It was a challenge at some points because some stories wanted to keep telling themselves, or rather go on, and I knew that they couldn't go on for too long, so I had to make some deep, sizable cuts. Like some of the chapters were like 30 or 40 pages longer, and they were turning into their own novels, and I really didn't want that. I wanted to be cohesive. So that was a challenge, having a good scene, but you knew that it was going on for too long, and it was like, okay, uh, you know, delete, and it was like 20 pages. So that's a lot of days worth of work.
I can only imagine how difficult that must be to have those stories and know you have to cut some out, even though you've written them. They're kind of like family at that point, but you have to cull some of it. So I know that you write in both English and Spanish. How I have so many questions. I'm not actually even sure where to start, but do you write the same things in English and Spanish, or do you write differently in English and Spanish? I mean, do you is this book, did you write this book in both English and Spanish, and how did that work for you?
Well, I don't think I could have written this book in Spanish. It's been translated. Um, so by a professional translator from Venezuela at the moment. I thought about translating it myself, but I just wanted to move on and do something else. And I don't think I'll ever sort of translate myself. It seems odd, but I write differently, I think, in Spanish and English because my sort of experiences have been different. I think I couldn't have written this particular book in Spanish, um, because, well, English is the global language, so there's a sense of that global um, version of it, or that global reality. But also, I tend to be different, and my Spanish seems to be more sort of mm, more local, more family oriented, more polite even. I sound more polite in Spanish. I think I'm much more sort of. I was educated in the United States, so there's a sense of the child in me is always more sort of closer to the Spanish. So I tend to write a lot of poetry in Spanish, and so the influences are different, actually, in terms of who influences my writing. So in the poetry, I hear Neruda, I hear Borges, I hear a lot of the kind of Latin American writers. And then in English, it's much more experimental, and I hear other writers, perhaps even the California writer William Saroyan, and all of these other writers that are present in my English, Bolaño and whatnot. So anyway, I think there's two different worlds. Sometimes people ask me, "What do you do?" So you're one of the few people who's nearly native in both languages, in terms of my accent or my fluidity. And I say, well, the way I do it is because there's two separate chambers in my brain, and I just access different ones. I access them at different times. But when I'm tired or something, and they start mixing, then it becomes a very different sort of thing, So I guess that's sort of an answer.
No, that's really fascinating, actually. And I mean, I'm fascinated by language anyway, but there's also a variety of languages represented in this book, from
Sure.
Spanish, English, Italian, Japanese,
Yeah.
more than just those. So first, how many languages do you speak, even just a little? And then how much research did you do in terms of the languages that you used?
Okay, so they say write what you know, and there's a lot of truth to that, but sometimes we like to go a little farther than that, than what we know. I speak English, Spanish, Portuguese, pretty well, though I've forgotten Portuguese, because I used to have a lot of friends from Brazil, and because of the nature of migration and whatnot, people come and go and stuff. So my Portuguese, I would love to practice more. But I can read, and I can write, more reading than writing and speaking. I can get by. And then my wife is Japanese, and I'm learning a lot of Japanese. I wouldn't put it on my resume yet. But I do know that if I went to Japan and I wanted to say, I'm hungry, feed me, or I'm cold, I could probably get by in an emergency. I have a lot of phrases, a lot of sentences, and I'm adding vocabulary. So one day, knock on wood, I will be fluent in Japanese. So I have a lot of interest in language, just too. I've taken Korean classes, but that was a failed experiment. Someday I would love to go back to taking more Korean classes. Interestingly enough, life gives you stuff, because if it were up to me, and my wife probably wouldn't like me to say this, because I'm paying a lot of attention to Japanese now, but if it were up to me, the languages that I would like to learn would be Russian and Mandarin, Chinese. So I have never had the opportunity, because you take what life throws at you. So life has thrown at me English. I was actually a mediocre English student in Ecuador when I was, as a kid, and I ended up becoming an English teacher. So I grabbed the English because that was given to me, and now I'm grabbing Japanese. But we don't get our choice necessarily.
Yeah, it really does depend on where life takes you. So that is fascinating. Exactly. Time for the second break of the podcast. When we come back, Patricio will be talking about types of research that he did for the books and the situations that happen within the book. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Patricio X. Maya. Let's get back to that interview. In terms of other types of research, did you do much for the book, or did you kind of draw on your own experiences for the storyline?
I did a lot of research. Not so much in terms of like anything, except for one chapter, because there's a chapter where, so there's a sort of terrorist organization in the book, the Coalition of the Eager, which is a nightmare terrorist organization in the sense, or, well, yeah, it is a terrorist organization. It's. I even struggle with the terminology, but they are the kind of nightmare scenario that somebody mentioned somewhere, and I don't know where, but I picked it up and I thought like that was genius. So like the thing that I read about was that what would happen is like the more sort of radical and dissatisfied elements from both sides of the political spectrum in the United States. What if both sides of those of that spectrum actually coalesced into like a dissatisfied third force, you know? And I thought, wow, that's a perfect nightmare scenario for fiction. Though that seems to have ruffled some feathers. I've gotten like notes, emails by readers saying, no, that would never happen. Well, you know, it's fiction. But anyway, in order to write that manifesto that the coalition has, I had to do a lot of research and step into that language. There's a whole chapter that's pretty much the manifesto, and the language is completely different. And I was at my most academic that I've ever been. It wasn't like it was an imaginative process, but it was mostly like the language is academic and completely different from anything else that's in the book. And I had to do a lot of reading, a lot of stepping into like that kind of lingo. And then, you know, I had to look up like the helicopter. There's a helicopter that is prominent towards the end of the book, in which the Arjun Parn is taken to and from places, to an American prison somewhere. I don't mind giving away the plot, but you know, so I had to look up like what helicopter do they use, and you know, actually I ended up learning quite a bit about helicopters and drones. I looked up names of drones and how they work, and the uses of drones, which are not always commercial. Sometimes they're military, and it's different, you know. So there's a good book on that put out by the New York Times. It's a collection of articles that they have done on drones. So I did listen to an audiobook on drones and a lot of other research, rituals. You know, one of the Ecuadorian Delphine who migrates is also central in the book. I did a lot of sort of reading up on so some of my experiences too, but my experiences were not his in many ways. So I did look up a lot of rituals by the indigenous population down there, and you know, I and some stuff that I knew from my own experience seeing things. So you know, I would say that I complemented some of the stuff that I kind of had a feeling for, and I just to make it more tangible. I looked up a lot of stuff, like a lot of stuff on religion, like Andean and religions from the Andes and whatnot.
And how about your characters? Did you have a pretty good idea of the characters before you started writing, or did they evolve as you wrote? Did you create any as you wrote because of where the story was going?
I created a few. So I had the main sort of characters. I knew that you know, how I wanted them to be. So But they evolve, you know. So I knew that I wanted one of them to be a gamer from Europe because somewhere I read, and you know how these things happen. You read something and then like 10 years later it's like it appears as an idea in your fiction. So I had read somewhere that Estonia, though it might have been Slovenia, you know, but it doesn't matter at this point. That Estonia had a kind of really good internet uh, sort of industry, a kind of parallel, um, how do you call it, Silicon Valley, right? And so I knew I wanted my character to be from Europe, and I didn't know how I was going to make him. So I knew a few things about him, and then when I started writing, it he took a kind of body and soul of his own. I did have to make some changes. Like there's a character, Alvo, who's one of the Japanese girls' boyfriends, who's a tennis player guy, and he was like, I was making him too much like myself at some point, like my voice, you know. Um, and I knew that I wanted him to have certain elements of who I am or some aspects of me, but that side that took over the character in a way that it was like not conducive to the story because it just wasn't the right voice. So I had to like rewrite that chapter. I want to say like two times until I found his voice. And even today, I'm not completely satisfied with that character's sort of persona because um I don't know, he's kind of like a quilt of people that I know, and it's not as coalesced as I wanted him to be. But yeah, just to answer your question, so some of the characters I knew that I wanted to come out in a certain way. Other characters were completely took me by surprise. When Delphine is coming up to the United States, he runs into a former guerrilla fighter from Honduras who'd fought in Cuba with alongside Fidel Castro. And that character, who turns out to be one of the most sort of most likable characters, especially in the audiobook, which is being recorded now. The guy who's doing the audiobook is having so much fun with that character. Um, that character anyway is I had no I just wanted him to meet some interesting characters throughout the way, but he said like, you know what, I'm gonna take like a good 10 pages of the novel, and I am like, okay, here you go. You know, so that character wrote itself. I don't know where it came from, but it's like that. You know, so a lot of the I wouldn't say a lot of the peripheral characters or secondary characters were took appeared by themselves. Sandrita, the that comes out in later in the story, she uh is was a kind of secondary character and became almost like a main character through the force of her language and whatnot. She There must have been some inspiration for her, but at the now that I think about it, I can see. But when I started writing, it was just like, oh my God, this woman is just completely self-possessed and whole as a voice, and who knows where it comes from.
I am fascinated by the concept of the audiobook because that
Mhm.
narrator has to do not only so many different voices but different different accents, different
Right.
just
Yeah.
wow. I'm already amazed by the narrator and I haven't even heard any of it.
This guy is amazing. Graydon Miller, my friend, good friend, who's an actor also, so that helps. Um, but yeah, you know, he's done so many accents for this book, and we wanted to go a little bit theatrical, not in the negative sense, but a little bit kind of lift up the kind of drama, and as opposed to just being a read book, there's an element of acting in it, and he's doing a great job, but it's taken a lot longer than we thought it would. So we are almost done with the audiobook.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
How about what are you working on now? Are you working on a new project?
Yeah, so I've had, you know, so that when I wrote this novel, Reggaeton Cruise, it kind of was very um, uh, fluid in the way that it just came out easily. And I thought, well, now all my books are going to come out like that, and but I was wrong. So I started a couple projects, and then I didn't really they weren't going in the direction that I wanted them to go in terms of the language. Um, and so I've dropped a couple of I've had some false starts, but now I think I have started something that's going to stick. And yeah, I'm working on a sort of detective novel of related to FIFA, which is the soccer world football or soccer uh, organization, and it has to do with um, African children being brought into Europe to become soccer players, and it has to do with sort of mm, exploitation, and also a lot of the themes are there. So global networks of exploitation, and also having a third party who comes in as a detective to solve uh, those issues. So anyway, it has to do with world soccer and criminal networks related to world soccer, and a detective who happens to be an Ecuadorian American like myself, written in Spanish.
Oh, interesting. I was kind of laughing when you were first talking about the reggaeton cruise sort of writing itself. Books are kind of like children, where you have an easy first one and you think, I got this parenting thing down, and then
Somebody should have told me that, because I was under the impression that it would just be like, okay, sit down. No, it's not. It's toil, it's work, and
time for our final break of the podcast. When we come back, Patricio will be talking about some of his other writings. This is his debut novel, but he has written a collection of essays and poetry, and so we'll be talking about some of those. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Patricio X. Maya. So this is Reggaeton Cruise is your first novel, but you've done other writings. Are there any other writings, maybe in terms of your poetry or anything like that, that you would like to highlight?
Yeah. So, and it brings me to a completely different kind of reader. So I have a book of poems that was published a few years ago. I want to say like 3-4 years ago. And that is just it's a collection of poems in Spanish. It's called 80 miles per hour, 80, number 80, miles per hour, mph. And that has a different kind of readership, from completely different in terms of language and whatnot. So I have some readers in Argentina and Chile and whatnot. And then the other book that was published is the one that sold the most, is a collection of essays, Walking Around with Fantian Bukowski, which is a collection of the critical work that I've done in terms of mostly photography, but also a little bit of work that on political bloggers around the world. And yeah, so those book of essays in English, Walking Around with Fantian Bukowski, which is critical essays, with a little reporting. And then for those of you who speak Spanish, the 80 miles per hour, 80 millas por hora. That's what I'd like to highlight.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
In terms of writing, obviously you've written in various capacities throughout your career, but what was the impetus, the final decision that made you decide to write for publication, whether that was poetry or essays or this novel?
To communicate, I guess, with other people, because I think a lot of writers, well, I'll speak for myself. There's a sense of, you think a lot, and there's an element of neuroticism and creativity that goes hand in hand. Um, so sometimes some of that um, self-inflicted obstacles that you give yourself, like, oh, you ask yourself a big question, what is globalization actually? And so, thinking about that in your day to day as you're going to work, or and being able to communicate, first of all, to put it on paper as a creative thing, and then having other people read it and tell you, oh, I get what you're saying, or it impacts me, or it or just starting a conversation with readers. It really is something else that I wanted to do. And so my publisher came in. It's a small Hollywood publisher, but as small as it may be, having somebody kind of help you with the publishing and spreading the word about your book, and helping you with readings and interviews, setting up interviews and all of that stuff is something that has really helped. So wanting to communicate, wanting to talk to people and start conversations with the language and perspective with it that I know and that I wanted. So, somebody might bring that perspective of the globalized world from a completely different uh, place, or with different dynamics, different language. So when I have a book, I say, well, let's have a conversation about this. But, the terms laid out on the table are the ones that come, at least initially, from the book. And that is something that I really love, that having those conversations about stuff that I'm interested in already.
From your experience, then, do you have advice for aspiring authors, and especially in your case, maybe bilingual aspiring authors?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Um, I was in a poetry uh, when I was writing poetry as a teenager. I took a poetry class, and the poetry um, teacher said something that it was a Spanish poetry class, and he said, I do have a little English, but I feel like it takes up too much room, so I would rather just focus on a single language. And then, I understood what he was saying. But at the same time, for bilingual writers, I would say, mm, find your voice, and write. Don't be don't try to sound like anybody else, because I think writers in general are going to sound different from one another. But in particular, for those of you who are bilingual, I would say, or speak multiple languages, it's like, let the rhythms of whatever language you're using take over your writing, and that's going to be your voice, as opposed to just kind of trying to craft it too much. And then also, I would say, in general, I think William Saroyan, who I mentioned earlier, who's the California writer from Central California. He's not too very widely read nowadays, but in his book, The Daring Young Man and the Flying Trapeze, uh, which came out in the 20s, I think, or 30s, he said something um, like, if you're going to be a writer, really taste food when you eat it. Uh, Really go out there when you go out on a trip. Really go out on a voyage, and when you get angry, get good angry. So in other words, have a very deep experience of life, because that's gonna save you. If language doesn't save you, at least having an interesting life will make your book interesting.
I love that.
Yeah.
You've mentioned a few books, a few authors. When you take the time to read for yourself, what are your go-to authors and genres?
So, I say that my literary father is the Argentinian writer Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, who is a short story writer and very different from my writing, completely different. But he sort of sustains me in a way. I go back to him all the time. So he's one that I read. I love reading a lot of I read a lot of poetry too. Uh, Mostly a lot of modernist, like T.S. Eliot. I like Joan Didion also. I like her prose. I love her prose. I love how she copied down like Hemingway's sentences just to get a sense of Hemingway's craft. Like she copied down, handwrote a whole book, if I'm not mistaken. So I love Joan Didion's style, and then a few writers of friends of mine who are around. Uh, Graydon Miller, who's the person who was the actor recording the book, is also a writer, and he's written a couple of great books, contemporary short stories. And my late friend Aldo Tambellini, who was an artist but also a poet, that I really recommend him. So those are some of the writers and a lot of the classics. Whether it be like contemporary classics like Russians. Love Russian literature, Dostoevsky, Bulgakov, stuff like that. And but yeah, like also like Shakespeare, all of that stuff.
Okay. How about internet presence? Website, any social media that you're active on? Anything you would like to share?
Yeah. So we are online at 80 miles per hour. On Facebook. I don't know exactly the address, but we do have a website for the book. It's reggaetoncruise.net. So reggaetoncruise.net, REGGAETON cruise.net, and there should be a lot of links there. And I'm on Amazon too. All my books are on Amazon, so you guys can get them there. And also some bookstores like Barnes and Noble, I think, and local bookstores in LA, like Book Soup. You can find some of my books there.
All right, thank you. Yeah. Patricio, we've talked about a variety of different things during our time together, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to highlight at this point?
I just wanted to add something in terms of like advice to young writers, because there's something that I want to say. That it's not only the big stuff, but also the small stuff that becomes very important for your writing. Like if you like sports, you can incorporate that into your writing. If you like cooking, you can incorporate that into your writing. So all the little stuff is also important. So I'll leave you with that message that, it's not only the big stuff that matters, but the small stuff is almost more important because it gives you detail for writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of fills in those wider gaps.
Exactly. So yeah, that's what I'd like to end with. And thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. And take care. And keep on listening to the great podcast. I found a lot of great interviews that I'm going to keep listening to myself.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you once again to Patricio for joining me to talk about Reggaeton Cruise, also his poetry, his collection of essays, and just writing in general. I really appreciate it. As I said, I always appreciate when authors come on, and I really enjoy that I get to interview so many debut authors, debut novelists in this case. He's not a debut author, but you know what I mean. I get to read a lot of novels that are debut novels from authors, and so I get to be introduced to authors that are newer at this. Doesn't mean that they haven't been writing for a long time, doesn't mean that they haven't written other novels or other stories. It just means that this is the first one that's been published, and it's very exciting to get to be a part of that in some small way, shape, or form. So thank you to Patricio, and thank you to all of the authors, and especially debut authors who join me for this podcast. It is so much fun, and I know I say that a lot, but it is. And it's an honor to get to be a part of those authors' journeys. If you are intrigued at all by Rayaton Cruz, you should definitely check it out. It is available on Amazon, and actually it's on Amazon right now on Kindle Unlimited. Is it unlimited? It is available on Kindle Unlimited, so you can get it there. If you have a Kindle Unlimited, I almost said prescription, a Kindle Unlimited subscription, it is available there, but otherwise you can get it in paperback or Kindle on Amazon. It is being developed as an audiobook, as you heard Patricio talk about, so I'm excited for that, because as I said, there's so many different nationalities and accents and different types of people that narrator is going to get to bring to life, and I'm really intrigued to hear how that all comes about. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, and if you're a fan of this podcast, please do me the honor of liking, subscribing, following, doing all those wonderful things that will get you new episodes as soon as they come out. Also, if you haven't done so already and would like to do this, please leave us a review, written or starred. It really helps us to get the podcast out to more people. Also follow on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I love hearing from listeners. I love hearing what you're reading, what you're thinking, what's going on in your world. Are you annoyed with the heat? Are you annoyed with how hot your home is right now? Or are you in an area of the world where you are not hot? Talk to me about the weather. Talk to me about books. Talk to me about whatever's going through your brain. I love to hear from listeners. Hope your week is going really well so far. I can't wait to tell you all about London and that trip. It's going to be quick. It's just a long weekend, but so excited. We're going to visit friends and can't wait to share that experience with you. As I said, hope your week is going well, but I always hope, what I always tell you is that I hope no matter what's going on in your week, that your week, your days, your time involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in as many good books as you possibly can. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.